Hello, hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? Hello, hello. So happy to host Rhodes Yepsen, Executive Director of Biodegradable Products Institute, otherwise known as BPI, on our show today. BPI has been a global leader in systems thinking and change through education, advocacy, and certification in the compostable packaging space. We get into the details of compostable packaging, various terminologies, and discuss how big change will happen. This, I'm sure, will be a learning experience for you as it was for me. Enjoy. So this is for me going to be a master class because I've been reading a lot about things you've been writing as well as some of the things that are available on the internet. We are very excited to have you, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me and excited to have this conversation with you too.
So Rhodes, one of the things that I could not find so much online was about Rhodes the person. I want to start with knowing you better and your childhood influences. What got you to this place where you think so strongly about leaving the planet better?
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. My parents are practicing Buddhists and are really interested in living a sustainable lifestyle. So we grew up as vegetarians. My parents met working at Rodale Press, so not the institute with the farm, but Rodale on the publication side. So they were both writers and editors. My mom on the outdoors side of things like backpacking and bicycling magazine. My dad in the book division working on some of the early organic agriculture texts at Rodale. And so growing up, I was outside a lot, really sort of learned intuitively about the Buddhist mindset and simplicity and really trying to be kind to the earth, whether those are plants or animals or humans. And so from a really, really young age, I was interested in environmentalism and what sustainability could mean. And that sent me off to Oberlin College in Ohio, where I studied a variety of things and was really attracted to their environmental studies programs. And still, even at college, I think I had a hard time understanding where I was going to fit in to the sustainability world. And after college, did a variety of things. And that kind of full circle brought me back to the Rodale community, where I worked at an offshoot of that organization called Biocycle magazine. And Biocycle is the forerunner publication on composting and organics recycling more broadly. So I got firsthand experience as an editor and a writer and a researcher on all of these topics that I had only known a little bit about, right? So I knew about sustainable agriculture and local food systems, but I didn't really understand the end of life aspect of all of those things. And as I learned more about food waste and the importance of compost and large-scale composting programs and the connection to the sustainable packaging movement, I knew that I was hooked for life, that this was my niche for sustainability. It wasn't just about sustainable ag more broadly or local food systems, but it was really trying to figure out the end of life of these materials, how we reduce how much we waste, and how we really think about this from a systems perspective.
This is almost music to my ears because this is all I think about from morning to night. So it's wonderful to hear that. Do you have early memories of packaging itself?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, I have, distinct memories about recycling and, there were impediments to this, right? It was harder to do and you had to pay more for the benefit of having a recycling cart. And I think those things were in the back of my mind. But beyond that, no, I didn't really have a lot drawing me to packaging until I got into food waste and composting and started thinking about how challenging it is to divert food scraps in particular to compost. It's really hard. So I grew up with a backyard compost pile, and we had a little food scraps bin. And so I was used to the fact that could be a little messy and stinky. And it wasn't until working at Biocycle magazine and sort of reading about some of these early compostable products, food scrap bags, right? They were probably the first one to be developed. And it was really critically based on how do you make it easier for people to collect their food scraps. And that had a really important connection to me. So even before packaging, just this tool, right? Why did a compostable bag exist? It was like, well, we wouldn't expect people to be collecting their trash without a plastic bag and telling them you're not allowed to use a plastic bag. But now we're telling people, well, let's take the food out of your trash, the wettest, stinkiest part of it, put it in a separate bin. But that's okay. You can just line it with newspaper, or you don't need to line it at all. Just rinse it out. That's okay. And as I started learning about these companies that were investing the time and research into developing compostable bags and how that could boost participation and make curbside composting programs widespread, I was just amazed. And that's really what led me to this broader compostable packaging connection, was thinking, well, if the bag has such a big impact, what about all this other stuff that can't go in the recycling bin today? And then with all of the other news coming out about the challenges with recycling, right? That just because you have access to recycle, just because you put it in the bin, doesn't mean that it's getting successfully recycled. So that really made me think more about packaging. What is the problem with items not getting recycled? If we have access and people are excited to put it in the blue bin, where is the system breaking down? And applying that logic to the connection of packaging to food, it is so hard to get food out of landfills, in part because we don't have access, but also in part because it's tangled up with all of this packaging that can't be composted. It's a contaminant. How amazing would that be if we started designing the packaging that comes in contact with food to be able to be diverted with the food to a composting system? And that's when I really started spending more time on packaging. But I would say it was food waste and composting and agriculture that led me to packaging, not the other way around. I know some people start at it from the packaging perspective.
There are so many follow-up questions I have on that. But there's one thing which, in your life journey as you went to Biocycle and then to BPI, but there's this one period where you were with Novamont. So would love to know what you were exactly doing and how that influenced your evolution and, why Novamont?
Sure, yeah. So I learned about Novamont through my work at Biocycle and doing these articles. So a lot of survey research on residential curbside composting programs. And then there were some of these early survey articles interviewing companies who were involved in compostable packaging to really try to get a sense of what these materials were, what types of products they were going into, the success stories, early success stories. And when I talked with Novamont, they were one of the ones who was really excited to talk to me about this connection to food scraps, right? This importance of compostable products being viewed as a tool, not as a replacement for all plastics. This has increasingly, I think, become part of the mantra for a lot of companies, not just for Novamont. But I think that they were the one that gave me that early thread. And so I did some articles looking at Italian case studies with Novamont, and was just really attracted to their approach. And they offered me a job as a consultant before they had a North American office, helping them on these topics of residential curbside programs, going to conferences and helping represent them and help them understand where things were going in the US for food scraps composting more broadly, but also composters and their feelings about packaging. So when they opened a North American office, I was hired on full time.
So let's do a little segue. What was Biocycle's agenda first, and how did you evolve that? And then, of course, switching to BPI as well.
Sure. I will be the first to say that I don't think I had a big influence on Biocycle. It had an influence on me. They are an organization that started with compost science and utilization, was the first publication, and really grew out of the early days of Rodale, when Organic Gardening magazine was organic gardening and farming, and it had a broader scope, not just the backyard gardener. And Compost Science, when it was a Rodale publication, it was started in 1960, so before the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So you think about this publication, this real force to be reckoned with, early on, these really early texts coming out in both book form and journals and magazines, talking about this big problem. There are these books about the food and city connection, how we had this increasing divide between cities where people lived and where food was grown and where waste needed to be managed. And so Biocycle, when I came in, was really, focused on the whole broader picture of organics management, right? And so that is, yes, for sure, about composting, but also anaerobic digestion, soil quality and soil health, upstream programs to mitigate food waste. I spent a lot of time doing everything And so, yeah, Biocycle, at the time had a print magazine, had conferences that it led. And so I got to see all aspects of that. And I don't think I've had a whole lot to shape with it. There was one interesting connection that when I was a staff member at Biocycle, it was the early days of a database called findacomposter.com. And BPI, which I didn't know much about at the time, was the founding sponsor that gave money to help start this activity at Biocycle. And then coming over to the BPI side, we continued to be a sponsor and actually have taken over stewardship of Find a Composter now. So that's been kind of exciting to see that connection play out. BPI, yeah, it was founded in 1999 as a nonprofit focused really on how do we start to clarify claims in the marketplace. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there started to be more and more claims about bio-based plastics, biodegradable plastics, and there were a lot of lawsuits coming out from attorney generals in the US questioning these claims that companies were making. And so a big 5-year project in the 90s at ASTM looked at all of the academic literature on composting, best practices for composting, real-world field testing of products and materials, lab testing, pilot scale testing, and came out with the ASTM specifications for compostability. BPI was right on the heels of that, forming to basically help companies go through the process of testing and making responsible claims. And the certification launched in 1999 was actually a joint partnership between BPI and the US Composting Council. And the original logo had the US Composting Council and BPI's mark on it as a way of saying that products tested to these standards will break down in facilities operated to the Composting Council's best practices and their operating guides. So it's a kind of a really neat match made. And I would say that what I've been able to do, briefly, we can talk about it more. When I took over for Steve Mojo, who was the founding executive director, I took over 7 years ago. I think what I really brought was this biocycle perspective, right? Of showing that the certification is of utmost importance, but it's the starting point. It's not the end point, right? And we had to grow and sort of look back through our bylaws and see, okay, what did our organization set out to do at BPI? It talked about the production, use, and appropriate end of life. And it talked about education, advocacy, and certification. Certification third, not first. And so we sort of put our heads around that, and I was like, see, it's staring me right in the face, right in the bylaws from 1999. It's saying we can't do this through certification. Certification alone is not going to get us to the system that we need. It's not going to help those items get successfully composted. We need all of these other aspects of how the item is used and how it's collected and composted.
Okay, so there's a bunch of questions which I'm sure many of the listeners would want to understand more, because there's so many terminologies in this whole sphere of sustainability that are going around. And I know that you have spent literally your life trying to decipher and define many of these. The first is the idea of recycling versus composting.
Yeah, it's exciting. And I think that sort of a caveat before I go into that is that I think that one of the misconceptions is that it's recycling or composting, right? Or that we have to demonstrate one is better than the other. And we hear this too with reuse, the push for more reusability, that somehow reusable systems are going to threaten our recycling or our composting efforts. And reuse and recycling and composting are not in competition with each other. We need all three. And there is so much waste out there that we should be reducing before we even get into reusables. Reusables are going to make sense in a lot of cases, but they won't work for all situations. In some cases, reusables may cause more harm. If you, for instance, have 100 reusable water bottles in your house, I don't know if that's necessarily a good environmental decision or outcome. And so I think, that's sort of an interesting context when we look at recycling and composting and the environmental impacts, is that when you think about the circular economy, and if you look at diagrams and charts of the circular economy from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, it's not actually one circle, right? It's multiple circles. And the way that it's been divided there, it's not just concentric circles, it's two separate sets of concentric circles. And so it's typically color-coded, a blue set of concentric circles that talks about the mechanical loop, right, of extraction and resource conservation and durables and reuse systems and recycling through mechanical purposes or potentially other ways to break the materials back down and have an effective reuse economy, recycling economy. The other side of the concentric circles are the green cycles, right? Which are the biological loop, thinking about the biocycle, right? I mean, how great of a name of that for that organization to have, right? The biocycles, plural, are that other part of the circular economy. And when you're thinking about compostable packaging and composting and the benefits and how that compares to recycling, it's a whole other separate thing, right? That's not better or worse. It's just really different because you have material extraction from plants predominantly, renewable sources that are going into these inputs for composting. And so already you're starting from a different spot. It's not about material extraction from finite sources. It's about material extraction from biological sources that can complete this loop. The huge climate change benefit from composting really is about the food scraps and the yard trimmings and mitigating the methane generated from disposing of these materials in a landfill or on the side of the road. And you're able to get this wonderful soil amendment that has, again, properties that are kind of hard to describe, right? It's not just that it's a fertilizer replacement. Compost has all these other properties: water retention, disease resistance, and a soil conditioner to really help the porosity of the soil. And compostable packaging has its own set of benefits. But really where it starts to see and shine is taking it out of the realm of packaging. So for recycling, to switch back, right? Recyclables and a curbside recycling program, that blue bin is all about the packaging and the products that go into it, right? In the composting bin on the other side, packaging is a small portion of what's going to end up in there. The food and the yard trimmings are the main part of it. And the packaging is really that tool to make it happen, to reduce contamination and make it easier for participation. And so I think that's what's really exciting is we're able to focus on this sort of broader benefit of composting as this whole separate bin from recycling. And it's about this broader connection to those biological loops.
So this is something that, again, people are typically confused about. So it'll be great to understand compostable versus biodegradable.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the more common confusions is around terminology. And I think the simplest way to say it is that biodegradation is the big circle, right? It is a very broad term, and we need to define in what environment is that biodegradation happening and in what time scale. And so that's really what compostability is. It's talking about the environment, which is composting, in which the biodegradation occurs, and then it puts other conditions in there around time frame and a pass-fail criteria to really define what that means. So you can have biodegradation in a lot of different environments, but claiming something that's just broadly biodegradable is a little misleading, right? You really need to get specific and talk about the environment in which that biodegradation happens. And that's why a lot of states around the US are looking at banning the term degradable or biodegradable because they see it as inherently misleading to consumers. You really need to be able to define that more narrowly. And composting is really the main claim to be made in terms of an instructional claim, telling a consumer what do you do with this item at the end of its life. There are some other biodegradation environments that are important, I think, environmentally, but maybe are less critical in terms of that communication to consumers for what they're supposed to do with the item. Things like marine biodegradation or soil biodegradation, which are really not instructional about what to do with the item.
And could biodegradable also be environmentally benign versus environmentally beneficial, whereas composting would always be environmentally beneficial? Is that a difference as well, or that may not be the case?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, this whole topic of is something benign versus beneficial, I think it depends on what what you're measuring, right? And so if something is, going to biodegrade in the ocean rapidly, which is part of the issue, is the ocean is not a disposal environment. We don't want things to end up in there. But if they are leaked into the marine environment and they break down rapidly, and we can show that through tests in science, does that mean that it is benign compared to a package or plastic that would remain for hundreds of years? Or is it suddenly beneficial? So I have a hard time with that one. I would say that they both have potential benefits and that our goal should not be just to be benign, to really have a positive impact.
So specifically, if I talk about something like oxy-biodegradable, so would you consider that as biodegradable but breaks down into little microparticles?
I wouldn't call that biodegradable. Unfortunately, I'm happy for anyone listening to the podcast to prove me wrong and send me test reports. But to date, We have not seen any test reports showing that oxo-biodegradable actually biodegrades completely. This gets to the environment, the time scale, and the pass-fail, right? A threshold that you need to meet. I do believe that if you put additives into a conventional plastic, which is what oxo-biodegradable claims are about, they're not about novel materials. We've not seen evidence that this truly converts those traditional polymers into being completely consumed by microorganisms. When we look at biodegradation in a composting environment, one of the core tests in our certification is looking at the organic carbon in a polymer, and then in a composting environment, how much CO2 comes off of that as the microorganisms eat the organic carbon. And we can measure in scientific ways that carbon is utilized as food, right? It's not just fragmenting, it's an invisible process. And for oxo biodegradation, photo degradation, there's something happening there, but it's not hitting that 90% threshold that we need for compostability or other true biodegradation claims in our views.
That's good clarification. The next one, and this is another sort of big one, home composting versus industrial composting. Materially, what is the real difference, and is there a better or a worse?
It's all about scale. Realistically, composting is one thing. It's not like there is some magical difference between backyard composting and commercial scale composting, or between the different types of commercial composting technologies that can get you to compost. But when you have a composting process, there's a temperature arc where you go through a mesophilic, so a lower temperature profile, to a thermophilic temperature, back to mesophilic. There are different microorganisms that are active in those different temperature profiles, and the microorganisms are what are generating that heat. And I think the difference with backyard composting versus commercial really has to do with that scale and that volume. If you don't have a lot of volume and you're not monitoring the parameters and conditions, so things like the carbon to nitrogen ratio or the moisture in the pile, that's a really big one, or the porosity to make sure that there's airflow, that you don't go anaerobic and don't have enough oxygen. This can happen at a commercial scale facility, but it's much more likely to happen in your backyard bin because you're not a professional, you're not monitoring it every day. It's in this small space. And so very often you're not getting the high temperatures. It's pretty atypical to hit a thermophilic temperature in your backyard. And so it's going to take longer. The process of biodegradation in that composting pile in your backyard is going to take, probably double the time that it would take in a commercial facility. And because you're not hitting those high temperatures, some of the materials that we've designed and certified as compostable are going to struggle to break down in those backyard systems because they really need that hyperactive commercial composting environment with the higher temperatures, more agitation, moisture that's really on spec. And so those are probably the biggest differences. Is because it's a smaller scale and a smaller volume, you're going to struggle to get the right volume for temperature, and likely you're not going to be monitoring things like moisture as closely as you would at a commercial facility.
Do you want to learn more about the end-of-life solutions and regenerative packaging products? Follow at Good Garbage Podcast on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And tune into our Trivia Tuesdays. Now, let's get back to the conversation. So the other one, which is very interesting, and again, I would love for you to throw light on, and you mentioned it in passing, you can have plant-based bioplastics, and you can have petroleum-based bioplastics, and you can have plant-based bioplastics that do not break down, and you can have petroleum-based bioplastics that do break down. So, how does this all shape up, and what is this kind of the whole dichotomy between this plant and petroleum idea?
Sure. Sustainability is a complex subject, right? It would be wonderful if it was so easy and we said sustainability is X, right? If you just did these three things, climate change wouldn't exist anymore, right? You meet the marker of the ideal citizen of the world if you do these things. And I think that that's really what comes down to, right? The term bioplastic is fraught, right? It can mean many different things, as you just said. You can have plant-based inputs into something that is chemically identical to PET, right? That you can still recycle, has no negative impacts on the quality of that PET. or other types of conventional plastics that can be recycled. And you see this most notably with the plant bottle at Coca-Cola or the Heinz ketchup bottle. Consumers may see these claims where they've replaced some of the building blocks that go into that plastic with plant-based inputs. It's still traditionally recyclable. It's not compostable or biodegradable by any means. And then, on the flip side, not all compostable plastics are made 100% from plant-based materials. And I think the way to sort of break it down is that it's all about carbon, right? Carbon is a basic building block, and you can structure that carbon into a variety of things, and a variety of durability, of compatibility for recycling or for composting. And that carbon can come from different sources. And the origin of that carbon is not what is determining whether it's recyclable or whether it's compostable. It's really how it's structured and the systems in which it's put in. If you go back to a systems-based approach, I think this is where the human mind, right? We're so innovative, but we frequently look at just one part of the value proposition, right? And this is a classic example. So it is for sure confusing, and I think that's the simplest way that I could put it is carbon comes from a lot of things, and even fossil-based materials, they came from plant-based carbon, plant and animal carbon, just a long time ago. So it's still carbon, and a lot of things that are able to be produced at scale. This is part of the packaging problem more broadly, right? Is it's a global economy, and the way that packaging has become so efficient and so affordable, right? Having a small impact on the cost of the food or other items that are in that packaging is the scale of production for these materials. And so for sure, compostability is moving towards plant-based inputs, and the majority of them have a high percentage of plant-based input. But one of the things we practice at BPI is really focusing on that system and saying, don't get too caught up over there, right? That's important, but it's one piece of the whole puzzle.
Super interesting. And that, I think, very well takes me back to the idea of local versus, this big supply chain. I'd love to know your thoughts on this idea of the impact of local versus this whole global supply chain that is needed.
Sure. When we think about it, food scraps and composting are a wet, heavy, putrescible, meaning they're quick to rot material. And by its very nature, the raw ingredients are not going to be shipped overseas the way other packaging waste streams are. Even once you've completed the composting process, finished compost is still pretty heavy, and it's not going to be, for the most part, not shipped overseas, right? It's a material that is best handled locally and regionally. And I think that's what's really exciting about compostable packaging in that connection is you start to break some of these chains that you're seeing, right? Some of these issues of the global supply chain of packaging, where plastic packaging in particular is collected, it's sorted, it's baled, it's sent overseas, where maybe it's further sorted, maybe it's burnt, maybe it's released into the waterways. There may be a whole separate economy of waste pickers, picking through things. And I think what's exciting about that food scraps and composting and compostable packaging element is suddenly you have this set of packaging that is collected with the local waste stream. It's not going to make sense to clean those compostable packaging items and ship them overseas. By their very nature, they're collected with the food and composted. They don't need to be separated. By the end of the process, they shouldn't be there. And so I think that's really exciting. And because we're really focused on redesign of particular unique items and items that make sense in a particular geography, we're also able to start seeing a regeneration of old conversion sites, old factories. And this dates back to my Novamont days. And one of the cool things that I got to see happening in Italy, where the country prioritized composting and started rolling out curbside composting programs. Novamont was a large player in the development of compostable materials and flexible materials like bags. The country also said, like many places, we want to get rid of single-use shopping bags. They're leaked into the Mediterranean. They blow around in their litter. But a compostable alternative to the bag is okay. And why did they do that? Well, for a lot of reasons. One is, again, too many reusable bags suddenly becomes kind of an environmental problem. If you have 1,000 reusable bags in your house, is that actually sustainable? For sure, you should have reusable bags, use them, but occasionally you might forget them, or you might have an extra couple items of groceries, that you don't need to buy another reusable bag for. So a compostable bag fits into this situation because it's a much lower impact to produce that bag, and it can be used as a tool to collect your food scraps. And so what happened was this big push for more composting a big push to get rid of single-use plastic shopping bags, but exempting compostables, making this connection with ad campaigns for people saying, this is a tool, right? It's not a regular shopping bag. This is a tool to collect your food scraps. And being able to see the regeneration of factories in Italy that had become outsized, right? They were too small to continue producing shopping bags. All that had been outsourced to Asia, right? To bigger factories where you could do it more efficiently. But now you're able to regenerate that because you need a smaller number because you've already banned most shopping bags. It's a small number of compostable bags that you actually need, just the ones in addition to your reusables. And so you're producing the material locally as Novamont, and then you're finding converters who are making the bags locally, and you're revitalizing a local economy. So I think that's this other aspect. It's not just that you're not shipping organics and compostable packaging in the global plastics after economy. You're also able to potentially revitalize and bring some of that production capacity for finished items into domestic soils, into local communities. And I could see that happening in developing countries and island nations where it's really hard, right? So maybe you have to bring in the raw materials, but you could convert it into the shopping bags and make the specific number that you need for your food scraps to collect for composting.
Super interesting. And of course, there's this other question, and I'm sure you sort of deal with it in one way or the other, is this challenge of process and production. You can have a very green material at the end, but are you using a greener process? So I don't know if that's something that you come across and you dwell on.
Yeah, I try not to dwell on it for the very reason that I think at the core of that thought, right, is the best solution is to use less. I think that a lot of the issues when you look at like a life cycle analysis, comparing a compostable plastic to a conventional plastic or plastic versus paper, the compostables, they're produced on much smaller scales, right? They have not been produced for the 50 plus years that conventional plastic has. It's less efficient when you do things on a smaller scale. And they're targeting a really specific section of the composting and packaging world, right? We're not trying to replace all plastics and saying that, again, the number one problem is that the plastic wasn't compostable. Let's just make it all compostable. If that were the case, then yeah, we'd have to have those LCAs buttoned down and show scalability is no problem. Once we hit the scale of polyethylene, we'll have the same environmental impact. But I think that, yes, of course, we need to be mindful of all of the other aspects of producing single-use items. When you produce things on a small scale and when they're new materials, you might not be as efficient as the incumbent material. And so I just try to encourage people when they get stuck on that and they're focusing on these LCAs to say, okay, take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. Like, we're things are getting better. And if you just look at some of the early studies on PLA, for instance, compared to the newer studies on PLA, as the scale has grown and the efficiency has changed, the LCAs are drastically improving. And we have some information about that on our website.
Yeah, I think that's so true because it's a journey, right? Plastic has been around for 70, 80 odd years, and this is just ramping up the whole bioplastics and the compostable packaging kind of segment. So I think you're right. If we get too stuck on the idea of process efficiency, then we may lose the end objective. I'm going to make a little bit of a switch to when we look at the globe, ultimately the idea is the same that, go towards a zero waste, cleaner kind of planet. But the whole certification mechanism is different, it's diverse. You can have the European OK Home Compost, and you have separate standards in India, and then US is mostly BPI. So is there any talk of a common global standard? How do you see it? And maybe there is already a think tank or thinking around that idea.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that for sure we think about a lot and talk with our member companies on our board of directors who, a lot of them are global companies. And at BPI, we do whatever we can to harmonize with other certifiers and other bioplastics groups to make it as easy as possible to reduce duplicate testing. And we do have, calls. I wouldn't say they're regular yet, but we do have calls, international calls of the different bioplastics groups and certifiers to really identify trends, try to identify common language and requirements. And so we are working on that and trying to figure out what does that system look like? Could we get to a point where there's a universal application used around the world? And what are the core requirements? And what are some of the differences and why do those differences come about? I think that's what's interesting, right? If you look at the compostability standards around the world, the core tests and the core pass-fail requirements are all the same. Where things get a little different is in the weeds, right? So for instance, should there be additional plant toxicity testing with earthworms? That's a requirement out of Australia. Should we ban PFAS, a persistent chemical? That became front and center for us before it did for the other certifiers, right? We started tackling that shortly after I was hired and had a resolution in 2017 banning PFAS. Those are some of the differences. And a key one is heavy metals. So heavy metals are regulated in the standards, and they're linked to regulations that exist in those countries or those regions. And they vary differently. In the US, our heavy metals requirements are linked to the EPA sewage sludge heavy metal limit. And so they tend to be a little bit easier to pass than the Canadian heavy metals limits or European heavy metals limits that are linked more directly to food and yard trimmings compost. And so there are international standards. ISO has some international standards, more or less, right? They try to detail what the different metals requirements are per country so that you can tailor your claim and your certification to that specific need. And I think this is where the dialogue is sort of headed, right? It's really important to have global standards and tests that we all align on. It's important to have technical reviewers doing the scientific assessment in the certification, which we outsource to an accredited technical body. But then you also need the local or regional group that really understands the market demands and needs. So if you look at our requirements, right, besides PFAS, we've added all these other requirements on top of meeting the ASTM standards for compostability. We have really strict eligibility criteria where the item has to be associated with food and yard trimmings. We don't certify conventional e-commerce packaging or sneakers, things like that. The item can't be widely recycled, so we won't certify water bottles or beverage bottles. Those are a coveted item for recycling, and it could confuse consumers and upset composters. The item can't be need to be disassembled, so you can't certify something that you'd have to take apart in order to compost. We require that the item be labeled. It can't be an unmarked item. That's pretty unique for us too. As we deal with contamination concerns in the US, composters are really concerned that after all that effort of developing and certifying and marketing and selling a compostable product, if it's completely unmarked, how is anyone going to know what bin to put it in? And so BPI has taken that hard step of adding more staff, complicating our certification process to do artwork reviews at every level, on product, market-facing packaging, consumer-facing packaging, to make sure that the compostability claim is actually showing up. And so I think that the long-winded answer is yes, we are talking and we're trying to figure it out from sort of these core levels of how do we reduce unnecessary testing? How can we collaborate and potentially not have people recertify the technical aspect and focus on this aspect of the regional or country-specific requirements?
So this makes me jump into this. You mentioned PFAS, and PFAS has, of course, been this hot topic of conversation. So it'll be great to learn more about the idea of PFAS and why it makes BPI so clear that this is not something they're ready to accept. And what is the alternate? So would you go back to a styrofoam?
I'll start with the second one first. There was a lot of concern, right, that with BPI sticking our neck out on the line and banning PFAS, that there'd be a rollback to styrofoam. And some of our companies threatened that to me, right? Saying, you're going to be responsible for companies readopting styrofoam. How is that going to make you feel? My answer to that is, look, it's all a learning curve, and we're really becoming an advocacy group, and it's an uncomfortable position. That's why you don't see other certifiers and bioplastics groups doing what we're doing. And it's a tension because we're a member-based organization. Our dues come from members. We don't write grants. And so a traditional trade association would never do something like the things that we're doing, where we say, we're going to ban something that you're using. Trade associations typically defend, right, what their members are doing. And what we said is, well, hold on a second. We're a trade association, but we're a mission-driven association. And if you look at our mission, we have to follow that mission. And if there's something that is not essential to compostability, if it were a question of microplastics and the science of biodegradation, BPI would fight that to its death, right? But with PFAS, it's not something inherent to compostability, right? It's not a compostable monomer or polymer, right, that has been developed for compostability. It's in there by accident for compostability. And so, of course, I don't want people to go back to, other single-use items that have to be landfilled. If in certain cases there is no PFAS-free alternative, I do think switching to a recyclable takeout container is probably the better solution rather than a PFAS-laden molded fiber product, because PFAS is one of those topics that it's so ubiquitous in the environment. I don't think that PFAS in compostable products is a significant contributor to PFAS globally in any sense, or a significant contributor to PFAS in a compost facility. But that's not really the point, because if composters and municipalities and governments and businesses who are developing these food scraps programs and relying on compostable products for that program to work in many cases, you think of a stadium or a campus, they're not able to go back to a food scrap only program. They need the compostable products to make that program work. If they can't trust that the compostable product is safe, if they think that it is a contributor and could be leading to PFAS in the compost pile, suddenly that trust in the value of compostability more broadly goes away, because composters are being regulated and asked to test. Is there PFAS in their finished compost? Is there PFAS in their contact water? And again, there is. There's almost always going to be PFAS in them. And by taking PFAS out of compostable products, I don't think there's going to be a measurable change. But what the change is composters and governments and businesses can trust that we're not a contributor to that. To be very clear, at first, when I heard about this, I was only on the job for less than a year. And I was like, this doesn't really sound like BPI's problem, right? Like, it's in almost no compostable products, right? Most of them use bioplastics or waxes for a grease barrier. It's just this one category of molded fiber products. And we're not the EPA, we're not the FDA. To your point, like, we don't know if it's transferring to food. The studies I've seen for a molded fiber product, it doesn't transfer to the food. But as we talked about it with governments and with composters, they were like, that's not the point. What about our compost? And what about the impact on our business? And if you think about the plant toxicity tests and the heavy metals tests, at the end of the day, what those are to show that there's no negative impact on the quality of the compost. And we wanted to add PFAS to that list to make sure that composters could trust the products. Does that make sense? I know that's a hard one.
Yeah, it is a hard one, and I can see it from your perspective that you don't want to be in a place where a finger is pointed to the compostable packaging.
Sure, because they don't know that it's just molded fiber, right, that had it. It could have been in everything, right? And there was no way for us to be able to really talk about that. And then also we learned, okay, well, a lot of the releases are at the manufacturing sites. Well, if our members are purchasing it, they're supporting the manufacturing sites. And so we were basically saying, look, we don't think we're going to solve the problem by any means, but if we remove ourselves from that, here's evidence that it impacts the quality of the compost. And some composters who specifically said it costs them more money if there's PFAS in their water or their compost, and said, we're not getting into the human or health toxicity issue. We're not getting into food contact. We're just saying it negatively impacts the quality of the compost.
Yeah, super interesting. The dynamics of systems in general. So switching a little bit, how do you see ultimately you need a lot of scale in the composting side, and how do you see that happening, and how do you want that to evolve going forward in terms of separation, collection, and then composting?
Sure. And this is why I think I like what I do. Predominantly what we're talking about, again, it's not access to recovery for packaging. It's access to collection and processing for food scraps and yard trimmings, in which compostable packaging can also be included, right? And I think that that's what's really exciting. It's also what makes the problem very daunting, because for recycling, if you look at something like extended producer responsibility programs, where you shift the cost of collection and processing from communities to the company producing the packaging, those extended producer responsibility programs, EPR, for recycling, it's not a clean system by any means. It's not simple, but it's fully funded, or the funding is shared, and it's all about the collection of packaging in a cart going to a facility that is dedicated to managing that packaging. For composting, it's not really like that. We're working really hard to get compostability included in EPR programs and in bills. So far, we're 2 out of 4 in the US out of states have included composting in their EPR legislation. And that helps us get part of the way there, right? It gets us to, if there's composting infrastructure, how do we incentivize and help fund the cost of handling packaging in addition to food scraps and yard trimmings? So I think that's part of the solution, right? And the packaging connection. What's daunting is the EPR for composting, packaging can't pay for a national network of collection bins for food scraps and yard trimmings. And so I think that that's what's exciting about it too, is we've started to spend a lot more time on the education and advocacy aspect of the system for compostability, which means, going to the federal government or to state governments and advocating for universal access to food scraps composting. And, we do that on the state level. Both California and Washington State have requirements that all jurisdictions have to offer organic waste collection to businesses and households. And it's all based on short-lived climate pollutants, so mitigating that methane in the landfills. And now it's our job, right, now that those are in place, to make sure that we incentivize packaging being included. We've gone to the federal government and advocated for $2 billion of grants and loans last year for food scraps composting. Didn't pass. And this year supported federal bills. I had the fortune to be able to testify in person at the Senate in support of a federal Recycling and Composting Accountability Act to really start to piece apart, like what's behind the system needed for recycling and composting at a federal level. How many collection programs exist? What are the barriers to these collection programs and processing infrastructure and end markets? And I'm feeling positive. I'm optimistic that people are realizing these two separate issues. What they haven't realized is how they connect yet, but they're recognizing the huge packaging problem, right? With more and more packaging public policy. And slowly there's more and more recognition of methane in landfills and curbside access to programs. The fact that if food waste and loss were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world after the US and China. It's like your mind explodes when you start thinking about that. And you tell that to politicians and they're like, wait, what? You can see them, making that connection, right? So I'm optimistic that we're going to get there. It's going to take a variety of mechanisms at the state level and the federal level for composting to get that access for food scraps and composting, both curbside drop-off programs, incentives for backyard composting and like trainings and free bins, which we're already seeing some cities like Austin do. And then on this other side, the packaging side, making sure that the packaging companies are helping support the costs for that extra burden of handling packaging.
That's good to hear. And you referred to it, and then I've read a beautifully put quote by you in one of the articles that you wrote, which was basically this: it's a loss of resources by taking it to landfill and to incinerators. And coupled with that is this idea of anaerobic digestion and then composting. And what is an ideal system according to you?
Sure. Yeah. It's a incredibly sad loss of energy and human energy, actual energy in terms of inputs and shipping materials all around the world, for food, only for it to be wasted. And there's some great little videos from the National Ad Council showing that happen for a strawberry. So not even, international markets, just like a domestic strawberry market in the US. And, looking at all that goes into growing this beautiful strawberry and picking it and washing it and packing it, sending it to a supermarket, then it gets picked out, and it's brought home, and then it goes in the back of your refrigerator, and then it gets covered in mold because it's in the back of the refrigerator, and it goes into the trash after all of it. And so, that's what just amazes me. It's like, yes, it's the methane in the landfill, but like, whoa, hold on a second. Look at all of that energy, all of that money, billions and billions of dollars lost, right? Just looking at the economic side. And so I think that's what is so, exciting and inspiring to me. I think that in terms of what is the best path? Unfortunately, it's like the sustainability is complex answer, right? There's no one size fits all. And I think that we're realizing that a lot in terms of curbside access, right? Curbside access is of vital importance for recycling and composting. But what's exciting for composting is it doesn't have to be just curbside access, right? You can have drop-off bins, and we've seen that successful in big cities like New York City, where they have, I forget how many, it's more than 30 drop-off locations to take your food scraps. And you can have backyard composting, you can have subscription services. And so I think that when it comes to like, what is the best solution, it's all of the above. And for processing, if you are collecting the materials, either curbside or in a drop-off bin, I think that sometimes it's going to make sense for that to go directly to composting and not anaerobic digestion. It's going to depend on the material stream. It's going to depend on, how far that material is shipped, what is it mixed with, and what are the economics in that particular place in terms of energy economy, right? What works in one place isn't going to work everywhere.
Yeah, super interesting. I wish there was one solution and we would all be it would all be great. One part which we haven't addressed, but is the market for compost. And hopefully the market for compost grows and there's an economic incentive for the composter to take more and more food scraps, more and more food packaging into that same stream.
The only thing that I would say yes and to is yes, you need to think about the scalability of your portion, and we all need to be involved in those other aspects, right? Of the development of the other aspects of the infrastructure. And I think, again, it seems to me that the problems that we're seeing are this product based approach, right? Where it's like, I need to improve my efficiencies, I need to meet local requirements, but, curbside programs or upgrades to the material recovery facility, the MRF, like, not really my problem. I hope that it works out and I hope that people figure that out, but I don't need to be invested in it. I think what's exciting is there's this shift now where people who are producing the products or using the products are getting involved in those other aspects.
Yeah, wonderful. Ultimately, how does it become an economic value proposition for a composter to actually take these materials and use it? Because as soon as it is economically beneficial, they will do it regardless of 1383 even. So how do you see that whole thing play out where there is a bigger market and a higher economics for compost?
Yeah, it's a good one. And I think that, this is for sure a huge conversation. And we hear, composters talk about this a lot, shifting the terminology and saying that they're compost manufacturers. And that terminology comes from saying we don't want to be treated like waste processors. And I think it's really interesting because I totally respect that and obviously see the immense value in compost and manufacturing high quality compost. But it is challenging, right? When you think about recycling and composting and the nature of collecting a material stream that cannot go to other beneficial use, right? So you reduce the food, you send edible food to humans who are in need, food that can't go to humans but is still fit for consumption for animals can go to animals. We don't want to be sending a lot of edible food to compost. So by its nature, there's a cost to collecting that material. There's a cost of managing that material at a composting facility, just like there is with recycling for all of that. And so I think that is a really tough one. We hear that a lot in California. In California, it's 70 to 80% of the money is made on the tip fee, so the fee for incoming, only 20 to 30% on the sale of the finished compost. Now that dynamic is going to change depending on where you are. And we know that in places where landfill tip fees are much lower, composters are making the majority of their money on the finished compost. And the tip fee is just barely covering, some basic costs for processing. But I think that that's really fascinating. It's this concept of how do we incentivize people to get into the business of composting? Just like how do we incentivize companies to get into the business of recycling? Being an optimist, I see a lot happening to improve that value of compost and the new Inflation Reduction Act. We're not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but it has a lot of funding going to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and some of that is around soil health, and so I'm very excited about that aspect.
Yeah. So the last one, what does good garbage mean to you, and how do you see that in the coming times?
I think that we're on the right trajectory. I think that it's an exciting time to be working on these topics, and I think that generally the world is moving in the right direction, acknowledging the interconnectedness of what one country does and the impact on another country and the impact on one another, right? And the need to make sure that, we're creating opportunities for everybody and we're not just swapping one problem for another. And I think that that's pretty exciting to think about when I think about, the concept of good garbage. And I think we're at a really awesome point where while we're in the early stages of compostable products and packaging development, we've got a leg up. We're not starting from zero. There are already, really innovative products on the marketplace that I didn't think I would see back when I was at BioCycle. They're pretty simple structures. And now we have like super complex items, right? Single-use coffee pods that are in the regular machines, as well as the little espresso style one. Those things have to withstand super high heat and high pressure. It's amazing. I mean, that's a technical feat, right? That the coffee stays fresh, that it can go into the conventional brewing device stand-in thing, or flexible packaging that can, hold our food and sit on the shelf for 6 months. and is not raising the price of that food. I mean, that's kind of remarkable, and we're just seeing it scratch the surface. So I think that's what's pretty exciting when I think about good garbage. I think that we're already starting to see the work of all of that, those early seeds that were planted, and I think it's just going to accelerate from here.
It's just so wonderful to hear you talk, Rhodes, because I think it's the optimist in you, and it's wonderful to hear. So I just want to thank you for your work from the bottom of my heart, and thank you for talking to us. And I'm sure there'll be so much learning. There's been so much learning for me personally, and I think there's going to be so much learning for those who listen to this podcast. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks for hosting this podcast and getting the word out, and thanks for everything that you do. Let's keep it going.
Thank you so much for listening to the Good Garbage Podcast. I am your host, Ved Krishna. Follow us on social media and never miss an episode at Good Garbage Podcast on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook.